I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We wish to congratulate you upon your election to this post. We welcome also other members of the Bureau. We are confident that this session of the Special Committee will be productive. We are pleased to see delegations in the hall during plenary meetings and working groups. The Russian delegation attributes particular significance to this special committee. The special committee, whose work is geared towards resolving pressing legal matters linked to the activities of the United Nations in the area of a peaceful dispute resolution and the maintenance of international peace and security. Pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 75/140, the Special Committee is called upon to continue to consider all proposals pertaining to matters related to the maintenance of international peace and security in all of its aspects, for the purposes of strengthening the role of the organization. In this connection, we wish to recall the following: the Russo-Belarusian proposal to request an advisory opinion from the International Court on the legal implications of states' use of force without the prior sanction of the Security Council, except in the exercise of their right to self-defense. This is an initiative that is geared towards strengthening the core principle of non-use of force as set out in Para 4, Article 2 of the United Nations Charter. As is known, the use of force by a state against the territory of another state, according to the United Nations Charter, is legitimate in two circumstances. Pursuant to resolution of the Security Council under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, on the one hand, and in the exercise of self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter. The Security Council frequently receives notifications from states with a reference to Article 51 of the Charter on the use of force for the purposes of collective self-defense against terrorist attacks. The question of the legitimacy of the use of force in response to the actions of non-state actors, including terrorists, is a complicated matter which does result in abuse in some instances. In this specific instance, the consent of a legitimate government is of utmost importance. In this connection, we believe that the Special Committee is a proper forum for the discussion of a full-fledged discussion on the issue set out by Mexico vis-a-vis the question of application of Para 4, Article 2, and Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. Another important issue on the agenda of the committee is the question of sanctions. We are particularly troubled by the imposition of unilateral coercive measures that are not rooted in international law and are done in the absence of the relevant resolution of the Security Council or in addition to them. Even under circumstances of a global pandemic, unilateral coercive measures have been imposed against 20% of United Nations member states. They are stripped of access to urgent credit mechanisms, lack access to necessary materials in market production changes. Some of the countries under sanctions are on the verge of survival without access to sufficient resources for the functioning of their healthcare systems, support for industry, business, and ordinary citizens. Those most affected are the least protected members of the international community, and within countries subjected to sanctions, those most vulnerable are children, women, medical personnel, refugees, migrants, IDPs, the elderly, and individuals suffering the consequences of chronic illness. The adverse consequences of sanctions are manifest not only in pressure on third countries, but also consequences in the corporate sector. For example, European countries attempting to trade with Iran, Cuba, and other countries under unilateral U.S. restrictions are finding themselves under tremendous pressure. given the consequences of COVID-19, not only the Secretary General, the High Commissioner on Human Rights, and the Directors General of the WHO and UNCTAD, and the General Assembly in Resolution 74/306, all of these called for member states to refrain from imposing unilateral coercive measures. In this connection, we fully support the proposal of Iran to devise guiding principles on ways to prevent, remove, mitigate the consequences, and rectify the damage from the adverse impact of unilateral coercive measures. These principles can be set out under the special committee, as was agreed to pursuant to the 64th session of the General Assembly. This was set out in a document on criteria for imposition of sanctions by the United Nations, which have been annexed to Resolution 64/115 of the General Assembly. This document remains an important and relevant outcome of the proceedings thereof to this day. Of particular interest is the timely Syrian proposal to consider the question of the privileges and immunities of UN member state representatives and other officials, which are necessary for them to independently deliver upon their duties linked directly to the activities of the United Nations. Arbitrary limitations which are selectively imposed by the host state targeting staff and permanent representatives of UN member states run counter to the principle of independence and equality. They are counter to the right of each member state to effectively participate in the work of the organization. Such restrictions are also imposed against the citizens of those states, even if they work for the United Nations as independent international civil servants. We believe that the special committee has the necessary authority and potential to consider this issue as well. This issue, which is directly linked to implementation of provisions of the United Nations Charter, first and foremost, Article 105. Mr. Chairman, the Russian Federation is wedded to the principles of international law as reflected in both the United Nations Charter and the 1970 Declaration on the Principles of International Law, including the principle of peaceful dispute resolution. Our delegation fully supports this principle. We emphasize that states are duty-bound to resolve disputes by leveraging means and mechanisms that are agreed to amongst them. States in international relations are free to choose various peaceful means for dispute resolutions. All means and mechanisms for dispute resolution need to be rooted in consent and be leveraged by states in a good faith manner in the spirit of cooperation, and they mustn't be subject to abuse. We urge delegations to support the Russian initiative to update the handbook on peaceful dispute resolution amongst states and to create a page on the official UN website on peaceful dispute settlement among states. We are thankful to those delegations who have voiced support in this matter. This year marks the 40th anniversary of the adoption of the Manila Declaration on Peaceful Dispute Settlement. We support the initiative of the Philippines to mark this date with the adoption of a General Assembly resolution. The Russian delegation also is thankful to the UN Secretariat for its work in drafting a handbook on the practice of UN bodies and a handbook on Security Council practices. Mr. Chairman, to conclude, I wish to comment on the statement delivered by Ukraine on behalf of Georgia and Moldova, which is unrelated to the agenda of the committee and is an oft-repeated propagandistic rubber-stamped notion repeated by Ukraine, which has nothing to do with reality. With respect to judicial proceedings at the International Court and the European Human Rights Court, we believe it is not appropriate to comment upon them in substance insofar as they are at the early stages of consideration by the above-mentioned judicial bodies, as well as given that this committee is not an appropriate forum in this regard. The decisions have to do with procedural aspects of the case. They are not related to the substance of the matter, and Yet, even as a temporary measure, the International Court acknowledged most statements by Ukraine as unlikely to be true. And the European Court of Human Rights also refused to consider the substance of the case brought forth by Georgia. In this connection, we call for an avoidance in the politicization of the work of our important committee. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our delegation intends to work fruitfully with the special committee.
Agradezco la intervención.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation for her statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Côte d'Ivoire.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chairman, my delegation aligns itself with those who congratulated you upon your election